Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Ty Camp, and I am the Assistant Director of the Franke Program in Science and the Humanities here at Yale. I serve under the leadership of our program's director, Professor Priya Natarajan. She's a luminary in astrophysics, you've probably heard of her, and she's also chair of Yale's Department of Astronomy. It's on her behalf that I welcome you here today to this, our last event of the academic year. The magnanimity of our benefactors, Mr. Richard and Barbara Franke, has enabled us to produce events and fund academic inquiry that bridge the divide between the sciences and the humanities. How fortunate we are to benefit from Mr. Franke's exemplary commitment to interdisciplinary study. With his signature investment, he's cultivated a space at Yale where scholars of all variety step out of their silos and expand the conversation across the disciplines, enriching their own research and that of others to a transformative extent. As we're photographing and videotaping this event, I'm compelled to state that there's a possibility you may be included in these visuals. So by being present during these activities, you consent to the use of your appearance, your likeness, and your voice by Yale University for standard nonprofit educational, news-related, promotional, and/or editorial purposes. In addition, the opinions and statements expressed by event moderators today and participants are their own personal views and do not represent the views of the university. So with those perfunctory disclaimers aside, I wish to acknowledge our co-sponsors who helped bring today's event to fruition: the Poynter Fellowship in Journalism, Yale Buddhist Life, the Good Life Center at Yale, Tricycle, the Buddhist Review, and the Secular Buddhist Network, as well as the Buddhist student community here. So now I'd like to turn the floor over to Reverend Sumi London Kim, the Buddhist chaplain at Yale, and also a soon-to-be Yale parent. Sumi, congratulations, Sumi. She's the author of 4 books on Buddhism focusing on young people and family life, and since 2018, she has served as the Buddhist chaplain at Yale. Welcome.
Well, good afternoon. I feel some compulsion to explain these reserved seats in the front, which have been inquired about. It's not that we're actually expecting anyone more important than our guests, but that we needed a line of sight for the camera. So just to explain that. What a joy it is to welcome all of you here to this wonderful event on behalf of the chaplain's office at Yale University. Just to give you a sense of how we'll spend our time together, in a moment, I'll lead us in a very short meditation, and then I'll introduce our guests. They'll be in conversation until 5, and then we'll have about a half hour for Q&A. And then everyone is invited to a small reception with light refreshments at 5:30, and 3 of Stephen's books published by Yale University Press will be available for purchase as well. So just looking out at this audience and judging by your radiant, serene, smiling faces, I can tell that there's an abundance of meditative experience already in this auditorium. So let's enjoy each other's company for a few quiet minutes. I invite you to lower your gaze, or close your eyes. Settle into your seat and relax. If you wish, we can begin with a gentle breath in through the nose, filling our belly first, and then up through the ribs and to the top of the throat, and then controlling the exhalation, breathing slowly through the nose, exhaling slowly, slowly, seeing if you can extend the exhalation so it's longer than your inhalation. And then at your own pace, another nice deep breath in, drawing in through your nose, filling your abdominal area, up through the chest to the top of the throat. Controlling the exhalation, slow, slow exhalation. Softening the body, relaxing. When you get to the end of the exhalation, just let your belly relax and draw the next breath in naturally. Allow your breath to re-regulate itself. Letting your body breathe naturally. Feeling the breath in the body. Feeling your whole body breathing. Bringing awareness to the felt presence of your whole body from head to toe, front to back, inside and out. Softening, releasing, relaxing the body. And including an awareness of the sounds and the environment nearby, in the mid-distance and farther away. Bringing awareness to the felt presence of people nearby. And all of us here in this space together. And when you're ready, I invite you to draw a gentle breath in. Gently exhaling, feel free to open your eyes and lift your gaze. And come back to here. Thank you, that was lovely. I suspect we could do that for quite a bit longer. But we are here for a purpose, so let me begin by introducing our interviewer. Bhikkhu Santi is a monk in the Thai forest tradition, which is a meditation-centered lineage in Theravada Buddhism. He teaches and writes at the intersection of Buddhism, modernity, personal life, and other spiritual themes, and has recent essays in Tricycle, the Buddhist journal. He is also a Yale College alumnus, class of 1998, and he lives on the free will offerings with no fixed abode. Bhikkhu Santi will be in conversation with, of course, Stephen Batchelor himself, a former monk in both the Tibetan and the Zen traditions. He's most well known for his breakthrough book, Buddhism Without Beliefs, which came out in 1997. And apparently he had a lot more to say in the following 23 years, because he went on to publish, no less than, Living with the Devil, Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist, The Awakening of the West, After Buddhism, Secular Buddhism, and The Art of Solitude. And just in case you've run out of Stephen Batchelor books to read, despair not. Stephen is working on a book provisionally titled Buddha, Socrates and Us, Notes for an Ethics of Uncertainty, which serves as a wellspring for this afternoon's conversation. Now, with that publishing history, and I didn't even list the other publications and translations that he's done, you would think that writing books is all he does, but no. He is also a contributing editor to Tricycle magazine, co-founder and core faculty of Bodhi College, and gives lectures and conducts meditation retreats worldwide. And in his spare time, does he have spare time? He's been a collage artist since 1995. And in the world of music, he collaborated with Sherry Woods, who I believe is here with us this afternoon, on a libretto for an opera on good and evil titled Mara. He lives in southwest France with his wife Martine, who is also here with us this evening. And that's a pretty good bio right there. My goodness, what an honor it is to have such a prolific writer and renowned teacher with us here this afternoon. Would you please join me in welcoming Stephen Batchelor?
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you for the introduction, Sumi. And thank you to the organizers of this event. It's really a privilege to be here. I'd like to introduce myself a little further in a very narrow way, namely as a fan and friend of Stephen Batchelor. As you see, I'm a Theravada monk. The second part of our conversation today, after we have a full, nice discussion of Buddha, Socrates and Us, will be about Buddhist monastic dharma, what it can mean in the modern world. And that's going to be later in our conversation. During this first part, we are going to hopefully dive deep into Stephen's current work in progress, which I believe is going to be coming out next year. Is that the hope?
I spoke to my editor the other day, and do we need some help with the mic?
I'll get it.
I'm surprised that the Buddha, in all his wisdom, did not foresee the advent of clip-on microphones.
May have.
The book
may be my karma.
It could be. The book is scheduled tentatively to be published in the fall of 2025 next year.
Very good. We'll look forward to that. I have had the privilege, well, I'll start the story at the beginning. Well, if you want to start the story way at the beginning, I have to thank Sumi for giving me an extra 10 years. I was actually class of 88, not 98. But thank you. So before I became a monk, before I really turned to the Dharma, the path of the Buddhist teachings, I encountered Stephen's work, a little book maybe some of you have read called Buddhism Without Beliefs. I read it shortly after my first meditation retreat, which had really kind of turned my life around, changed my direction in life. And it was just what I needed for my intellect to join fully in that turn. It was just what I needed to embrace this the kind of imperative that first retreat had imposed on me to really look seriously into the Dharma, and it really helped me to get started on my own kind of exploration of the Buddhist teachings and the path that it indicates. I'm delighted to have a chance to share a little bit of that today. But first, I'm going to finish the story of my being a Batchelor fan. I read that book. I read several others of Stephen's during my years as a Buddhist lay practitioner. Then I went to the monastery, and I stopped reading very much at all for quite a few years. 5 years later, when I popped out of the monastery, I wrote Stephen a fan letter. I had never, of course, met him. I was just a reader. But when I popped out of the monastery, I had the freedom to pick up keyboard once again, and I just thought, why not? You know, this guy had a really powerful influence on me, and I've now had this powerful 5-year experience in a monastery. Maybe there could be some dialogue there. And he responded with remarkable generosity for a extremely, well-known, well-established voice in Buddhist circles, and actually quite a bit beyond now. Wrote back quite generously. A dear friend sponsored me for a course that that Stephen was offering called After Buddhism and Beyond, based on, or rooted in his book, After Buddhism, which I recommend and is going to be on sale in the lobby afterwards. And during the course of that program, we got to know each other a little bit more. And since then, we've just been in touch. Stephen has generously continued to engage me in dialogue, and we've been able to to talk across what you might perceive to be a divide, and I hope we will reveal not to be such a one between the secular and monastic Buddhism. So probably Stephen's book will take us there before we get to the later part of the conversation, but why don't we dive right in? Let's talk about Stephen's work in progress, Buddha, Socrates, and Us. So the figure of the Buddha is probably an important part of the lives of many people here, I'm suspecting. Socrates, maybe less so. But who knows? We're on the campus of, a very representative, elite, Western liberal arts institution. Maybe there's some Socratists among us. Let's start with the perspective of people who are coming from the Buddha. Actually, let's start with both. Stephen, how would you describe the central problem or issue that each of these representative figures, the Buddha, Socrates, separately or together, addressed in their storied careers?
Okay. I think perhaps the place to begin, which is the literary conceit that underpins the book, is that recent scholarship, particularly the work of Professor Gombrich in Oxford, has revised the dating of the Buddha, brought it 80 years closer to our time, in contrast to what traditionally has been believed, and in doing so has made his dates identical to those of Socrates. They both lived in the 5th century BC. The Buddha was thought to have lived in the 6th, and they were born roughly 10 years apart, and they died pretty much around the same time. And so they were contemporaries. They were on Earth at the same time, more or less. And I think they were, in a way, not only physically contemporaneous, but they both dealt with a somewhat similar world, a world that had moved out of an agrarian type, rural societies. They were both inhabitants of a world in which cities were dominant. There was the emergence of kings in India. And both of them, in terms of what they were teaching, was to put the emphasis very much on ethics. Ethics in the broader sense, not just simple morality and following precepts and rules, but ethics as understood as a cultivation of the whole person, what it means to lead a good life on this earth. For Socrates, this is very clearly a break with the kind of philosophy that had preceded, which was largely an early natural philosophy, trying to understand the nature of the world, the nature of reality. And the Buddha likewise lived in a world in which people were in a very turbulent time, which is the same as Athens in the 5th century BC. And rather than seek some ultimate truths about the nature of the world and so forth and so on, the Buddha likewise emphasized the importance of how we think, how we speak, how we live in the world with others. In other words, putting the focus on ethics. The Buddha's famous for having refused to answer the standard metaphysical questions of the day, and kept turning his teaching back to the challenge all of us face, which is to recognize what it is that prevents us from leading a full and flourishing life. And his meditations, his teachings are all about, in his words, removing the arrow of craving, ignorance, reactivity, in order that we can lead a life unimpeded or less impeded by these negative patterns of thought and behavior, some of them psychological, some of them social and cultural, that prevent us from leading a full life. So that, I think, is what brings them together, is the emphasis and centrality of ethics, although in both cases, starting already with Plato in his dialogues, there is a shift away from ethics towards ontology, the nature of being, Plato's theory of ideas and so on, which are put in Socrates' mouth, but are not really compatible with how Socrates is presented in the earlier dialogues. And likewise, in Buddhism too, Gautama's very pragmatic and ethical focus quite quickly became taken, or not so much taken up, but in a sense actually got a little bit lost, I think. And Buddhism started too to develop theories like in the Abhidhamma and then the early Buddhist philosophical schools. And so the ethical focus is what I really wanted to concentrate on in this book.
So both Socrates and the Buddha were focusing us on how to live a good life, on how to live an ethical life, more so than on how to understand the universe, how to explain things. You mentioned Richard Gombrich. I quite like his idea of the problem situation. He borrowed from, I think it was Popper, he was quoting, or he got that concept from, who encouraged us to look at the sort of social historical context of figures like these, to understand where they're coming from. Maybe diving a little bit into Socrates, I think it's really an interesting move in your book that rather than digging into the minutiae of the Platonic dialogues, you spend quite a lot of time on Greek tragedy, on the playwrights, and set forth the context of what Socrates has to teach us in that context. Maybe you'd like to share a little bit about that context with us.
Well, one of, again, another literary conceit that I employ in this book is to imagine what, had there been a follower of the Buddha, a Buddhist, an early Buddhist, in Athens in the 5th century BC, who had witnessed the flourishing of philosophy, of theatre, of the arts, and so on and so forth. How would they have seen that? What would that have meant to them? And it is theoretically possible that such a person did do that, but extremely unlikely, but it's a possibility. And I think a Buddhist would have been in Athens at that time, would have wanted to know, how did these Greeks deal with the question of suffering, of dukkha, which is really the starting point of the Buddha's concern. You know, we suffer, we're born, we die, all kinds of things happen that we would rather didn't happen, and we have to come to terms with that. And that is very central to the Buddhist ethical understanding of human life. But if you look in Plato's dialogues, if you look into the index and look at the word suffering, it only occurs once. It's not a topic that was picked up by Greek thinkers or philosophers. And the one time it does occur in a Platonic dialogue is in a dialogue that scholars now believe was written about 300 years later. So it clearly wasn't a main theme. So how did the Greeks in Socrates' time come to terms with the incredible suffering they were undergoing, which was created by the Peloponnesian War? And in Diogenes Laertius, who was a 3rd century philosopher who wrote a famous book which is translated into English, The Lives of the Great Philosophers. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. It's an incredibly important book for our knowledge of the ancient Greek world. When he gives his potted biography of Socrates, having mentioned Socrates' parents' names, the first thing he says is that Socrates was known to have collaborated with Euripides, the tragedian, who was an exact contemporary, more or less. And then they give he quotes several classical sources that say exactly the same thing. He said, they say Socrates and Euripides were bound together. They were bonded together. Now, curiously, that's not a theme that has been picked up or developed by any. If you buy a book on Socrates, it's very unlikely that will even be mentioned. The only Western thinker who in a sense becomes very interested in that point is Nietzsche, in his book The Birth of Tragedy. And he sees the influence of Socrates on Euripides as a negative one, how it, in a sense, compromised the heroic nature of tragedy, the great heroes of the Homeric past and so on, and reduced tragedy to the ordinary suffering of everyday people. Nietzsche says that Euripides brought the spectator onto the stage. And Euripidean tragedy is one that doesn't dwell on the heroic past so much as focus on the actual suffering that people are undergoing in the world now, in the world of his time. And many of his plays, we can see quite clearly, are actually ways of presenting the audience with tragic circumstances that were going on in that time of Athenian history. So for him, tragedy was not heroic in that sense. It was something that was right at the heart of what it means to be human. And the influence of Socrates, I think, was to bring his primacy of ethical thought onto the stage and to allow the theatre, Euripidean tragedy particularly, to be a kind of civic therapy. That the people watching these plays for the first time were being spoken to very directly concerning the suffering that they were undergoing, and the plays were somehow allowing them to process that experience, to understand it, and to find appropriate ways of actually coming to terms with the crises of their time. So by doing that, I'm not just looking at Socrates and the Buddha, I'm looking at Socrates as set against the backdrop of his moral world, which I think was best exemplified through these festivals that occurred, the Dionysian festival in Athens, but also other places likewise in Greece of that time. And I think the theatre became very much the moral arena in which Socrates' ethical philosophy was somehow performed and displayed in a public environment.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that really directly answers my question. And I think you'll find in reading the book that Stephen's evocation of what was happening on those stages gives a really concrete sense of the problem, the situation of the times, of how the suffering in the lives of Athenians was unfolding in the strife that was tearing apart their society, really over not that long a period of time. The span of Socrates' life traversed the whole arc of Athenian democracy. So that was what Socrates was addressing. Let's turn to how he addressed it, and in particular, how Socrates taught. How did he teach, and what did he teach? What would you like to share with us about that?
Well, if you read the Apology, which is the defense speech Socrates made against the charges set against him of corrupting the young and introducing new gods and so on into Athens, in the course of that speech, he says, I'm not a teacher. I don't have students. I don't teach anybody anything. Which has got a kind of a Zen ring to it, I think. But what it points to is that he saw his role not as someone who had greater wisdom than everybody else and he delivered this to the people who passively accepted it. Socrates saw himself as a gadfly. And in his own words, he says that he feels that he's been somehow destined to be a gadfly on the slumbering body politic of Athens, to wake people up. Now that, of course, is a very Buddhist notion. The word enlightenment or bodhi means to wake up. I think likewise the Buddha was interested in waking people up. And the way that Socrates did this was spending all day in the marketplace, the agora of Athens, and literally accosting people, it sounds sometimes, in such a way that he would challenge them, to try and find out what they knew, to try to question their received opinions and the habitual thoughts and ideas that they just sort of uncritically carried with them, and really probing them to try to get them to think for themselves, to become more autonomous in their thinking life, in their reflective life. And in this regard, his teaching method was actually a method that included endless critical inquiry with an actual interlocutor, people from all strata of society, not just the people like Alcibiades and these aristocrats, but also blacksmiths and people of all walks of life. He didn't see this as an elite activity. Philosophy was about how to live well, not to become an academic or something like that, or be a professor at Yale or something. So his methodology was, he never wrote anything, and that's another parallel with the Buddha. The Buddha never wrote anything. Their teaching was very much focused into the actual situations of people's lives at that time. It was immediate. It was therapeutic in that sense. It was to heal. It was to wake up. It was to cure. It was to enliven. It was to get people, to live, more authentically, more truly.
Well, you've already begun to answer the question that your reflections prompt, so maybe you can make the connections a little more explicit. How might someone who is interested in, or even a follower of the Buddha, then regard Socrates? What does Socrates have to offer someone who comes from the perspective of a follower of the Buddha? And you started to draw some of those connections already in a way that I can already start to answer the question for myself. But you might also share some of your, maybe in summary, your critique of orthodoxy in Buddhism.
Well, my sense is that in the early Buddhist suttas, particularly I think of something like the Sutta Nipata, which is one of the earlier layers of the Pali canon, you get a very similar kind of ethos, I feel, that the Buddha's not so much, or whoever is the speaker in these earliest texts, is not so much concerned with presenting what we would now understand as the standard Buddhist doctrines. The oldest layer of the Pali texts, curiously, does not talk about the Four Noble Truths or the 12 links of dependent origination or these well-known Buddhist lists that, even a cursory look at a book on Buddhism today would immediately introduce you to. But there seems to be much more a kind of skepticism at work. I would argue that the Buddha was, in fact, a skeptical ethicist or an ethical skeptic in some ways. He was concerned with how to live well, but he didn't feel that required that you hold certain metaphysical or dogmatic views about the nature of yourself or the nature of reality. But rather, he sought to engage them in a process of inquiry. I think that's a very important point of a comparison. Of course, there were differences as well. I mean, Socrates, for example, served as a hoplite, as a foot soldier in the Athenian army, and he was involved in some very, very horrible battles, and that was not a problem for him at all. He felt that was his duty to defend his city, to protect the world in which he valued. The Buddha was committed to a principle of non-violence. You can't imagine the Buddha taking up a sword and going off and fighting. It was completely inconceivable. So there are significant differences in the way that these two men lived. But I think underlying those differences, there is a core, a common core, of this question of how do I live well. I think of the two of them as fraternal twins. In other words, they were born at the same time, which is true, and they come from the same womb, as it were, of that period. But they don't look the same. They're not identical twins, they're fraternal twins. So that's, I think, a useful image to perhaps portray their relationship.
So the parallels that you're drawing are starting to emerge. We're getting a picture of these two figures in ways that we can find useful in our own kind of reflection on how to live. But as representations of actual people who walk the earth, there's a huge amount of interpretation that has to go into creating these portrayals. I think I shared with you once the quip I came across by Paul Valéry, who said, ancient Greece is the most beautiful invention of the modern age. Yeah. Stevens articulated for us a Socrates and a Buddha, but of course there are competing images of each of these figures. They're representative figures. Western civilization has its classical age, which was embraced quite critically until fairly recent, quite uncritically until pretty recent times. Of course, Buddhist culture has its classical age, the time of the Buddha. You have, very importantly, I think, as a philologist, you've challenged some of the conventional understandings of who the Buddha was. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit more about the good Buddha and the bad Buddha, like the Buddha that you point us towards as a source of inspiration, as a source of, as a teacher for our spiritual development, and the representations of the Buddha that you feel lead us astray.
Well, I think before going on to that exact point, we have to, one of the big differences we have with Socrates and the Buddha is that in the Buddhist tradition, we only really have one portrayal of the Buddha, broadly speaking. With Socrates, we have at least two different texts or writers, really. Plato, and the Socrates I've been speaking of up to now is basically Plato's Socrates. We also have the memoir of Xenophon, who was also a student of Socrates, a contemporary of Plato, who gives us a very different picture. And if you're used to the Platonic version of Socrates, it comes as a bit of a shock to read Xenophon's memoir of Socrates, where Socrates comes across as a much more traditional kind of teacher. You even get the sense that he recruits students and he gives, lectures on, what to do under these circumstances and that circumstance. You even have one dialogue in Xenophon where Socrates is talking to an estate manager and explaining to him how best to run their business. I mean, you will find that with the Buddha, but the point is you get two very different pictures. In other words, what we have of Plato, we can see Socrates from Plato's point of view, from Xenophon's point of view, and that creates a more three-dimensional picture of who this man was. It also, rather disquietingly, explodes the idea that there is just one correct representation of this person. It's a little bit unnerving to deal with that. In the case of the Buddha, what we essentially have is the Buddha as remembered by his monastic followers. There are hints in the suttas of a different kind of person, and it's those hints that I've also explored in some of my other books to try to portray a much more human Buddha, what happened, I think, quite quickly in Buddhist tradition is the Buddha became increasingly elevated to the status of a kind of God, really. Someone who is completely perfect, omniscient, without any flaws in his mind or in what he said, that there's something approaching perfection in the notion of the Buddha. And yet, you do still find, if you look carefully, stories, episodes of not that perfect figure, but of a human person. One might say it's comparable to the quest in Christianity for the historical Jesus as opposed to the figure of Christ. And so in that regard, I feel that both traditions evolved images of who their founders were. And in doing so, I think, in both cases, I think, lost touch with the humanity of those founders and turned them into rather iconic, symbolic representatives of a certain ideal of humanity.
Mm. Which brings us to secular Buddhism, I would say. Would you like to, for those who have not checked in with Stephen's writings in recent years, share with us your idea of the Buddha that we stand best to learn from, and maybe what some of the core principles might be. I'm thinking in particular of your formulation of the four tasks, just what the basic gist of how you suggest we approach his teachings.
Well, very much in line of what we've been saying, particularly how both the Buddha and Socrates appear to have been people who sought to question the status quo, who were very suspicious of metaphysical truth claims and religious and philosophical dogmas. Both of them emphasized the priority of action over belief. And in that sense, I feel that what the Buddha is really trying to get us to do is to change the way we behave, to change the way we think about things, to be aware of and to be more aware of the consequences of what we say and what we do. And so in this regard, rather than basing Buddhism on the doctrine of the Four Noble Truths, which is broadly accepted by most Buddhist traditions as the kind of underpinning doctrine that makes the whole thing intelligible, to think of not so much in terms of truths but in terms of tasks, that rather than thinking that craving or ignorance is the cause of suffering, which is the second noble truth, to think of that more in terms of how do I deal with craving, let's say, or grasping or anger or whatever it is. It's not so much that you have a belief that it causes suffering, but it challenges you to respond to craving and anger and these sometimes destructive mental habits that that preoccupy us so much. And there we find, I think, a core practice, which is the practice of just letting that be, not getting sucked into its imperative that is speaking to us so loudly in our minds, but being aware of that, being mindful of that, and then just letting that be, not suppressing it, not denying it, but letting it be. And this, of course, I feel, is the very heart of all of the mindfulness interventions we find that are so widespread today. The mindfulness movement has stripped all these ideas of Buddhist belief or religion, but has landed on something that I think is very much at the core of what the Buddha taught. Mindfulness is not just some marginal practice done in some traditions, but it lies right at the very heart of the Dharma. And this is for people in this world today who practice mindfulness. They're not interested whether craving is the cause of suffering or not. They want to know how to deal with their own cravings in a way that doesn't keep them stuck and blocked, but allows them a freedom to respond to the world in a way that's not determined by the habits of their culture or their own psychology, but allows them a certain freedom. So I don't really want to say more than that about this, but I would actually like at this point to turn our conversation to this theme of secularity, and particularly in terms of your practice as a Buddhist monk. I think for many people, a monk, whether it's Christian or Buddhist or whatever, is in a sense the incarnation of a particular kind of religiosity. It's very difficult to think of a non-religious monk. Why would you bother, you know, if you didn't have some religious beliefs? And Santi sent me just the other day, actually, a text he's written called Self-Sayings of a Sometimes Secular Monk. And this brings us to the theme of our discussion, really, which is, you know, secular Buddhism and the timeless, which is not to do with the particular features of our secular world, but to acknowledge those more eternal, timeless constants in human life that we find are being addressed in the Buddha and Socrates and other spiritual and religious traditions. So what do you mean by being sometimes a secular monk? And how do you relate to the concept of religion? Do you see secularity as somehow opposed to religion or not?
I do not see secularity as the opposite of religiosity. Mm-hmm. Everyone has a religion. Everyone has a religion. You might be part of an organized religion, or you might reject organized religion, and that's part of your religion. We all have, to quote David Foster Wallace, the American writer, we have something we bow down to. We have some system of beliefs that we regard as the true ones. The ones that aren't just beliefs, but the ones that are actually true. Well, that's your religion. For me, the forms of monastic Buddhism are not articles of faith. They're not signals of some set of beliefs. One of the things that especially attracted me to monastic Buddhism is that there is no requirement of faith. There's no requirement of belief. It's a very different form of monasticism from Christian monasticism, although I admire many Christian monastics deeply. The idea for me as a sometimes secular monk, sometimes secular religious Buddhist practitioner, is to find a way to bring my own personal inquiry into the nature of things, what we call the Dharma, to find a way to reconcile that with what I understand as a modern person, a person whose psychology was shaped by all the factors of modernity that have shaped all of our understandings. A commitment to science, a commitment to many of the small L liberal values, my questioning of hierarchy, my commitments to various forms of various human rights and forms of human association. When I went to the monastery, I encountered a lot of orthodoxy, of the kinds that Stephen objects to in his writing, and rightly so. And I was willing for some years to kind of to just overlook that. I was deeply into my personal meditation practice, and I was willing to, in some senses, check my values at the door with regard to those time-based secular commitments. But as I developed, that became less tenable, and I took advantage of the emphasis on the Buddhist path of developing independence in the practice. We have this very strict structured training, but it aims at making us independent of any teacher. Religious Buddhists take refuge. That's the basic concept. We take refuge in the teachings of the Buddha. We take refuge in our understanding of the nature of things, and maybe we can say a little more about that. That actually connects directly with Stephen's question about the sometimes. And we take refuge in the institution of Buddhism, of the Sangha, as a kind of vehicle of the teaching. But instrumental to answer your question, essential to the Buddhist path is the recognition that we actually aren't all one thing or all another thing. I notice in myself, especially early on in my kind of personal liberation from the more orthodox aspects of monastic practice, a kind of fieriness that came in when I thought about my principles and my values. It took a real kind of summoning of self to oh well. I was mumbling anyway.
I'm not hearing you anymore.
Oh well.
It's because I really have to put it up here.
Why not use the mic?
We're too deep in.
That's fine.
I'll do my best. I had to get kind of doctrinaire about my own ideas, my own interpretation, in order to free myself from the sort of entrained subservient attitude that was expected early on in my monastic training. But as I moved on from that, I realized that that too was a kind of attachment, and in fact, most people aren't really living on the philosophical plane. Most people aren't wrestling with deep questions and deep issues on a day-to-day basis, and at the same time, many people are doing just fine. Many people are quite able to square themselves with the world and live meaningful, full, purposeful lives without having to take strong stands on this set of values or that set of ethical commitments. So I eased off a little bit, and I only assert my secularity sometimes. Sometimes I like to just kind of hang out and be easy.
But I mean, I lived as a monk for about 10 years also, and one of the things that I found challenging, particularly when I came away from an Asian monastery where it's no problem at all. When you come to the West, maybe this was different 40 years ago, but when you walk down the street with a shaven head and robes, you're actually making a very powerful statement. In Asia, you just become another anonymous monk. Here in the West, you are actually standing out. And for many people, you are basically affirming a kind of religious identity. You are visibly a Buddhist. You're visibly, to those who know, a Buddhist of a particular order or particular school. And I found that when I was a Tibetan Buddhist monk walking through Switzerland, for example, where I lived, that I found that got in the way of my interactions with people. They related to me very much as how they perceived monks to be, as how they perceived Buddhists to be. And I found that made, and sometimes that meant they shied away from me. They didn't like the monks, for example. At other times, I became a screen on which they could project all of their idealistic fantasies about spirituality and enlightenment and so on. So how do you deal with that?
Well, I've experienced both of those, absolutely, and frequently do. And it is challenging. I work at being a monk, but I'm a person. It's difficult to have it's difficult to have those assumptions made that put constraints on your ability to relate to people in different ways. But there's one more function of presenting to the world as a monk that I think still is alive in the world. I know it is because it worked on me when I encountered monks early in my Buddhist practice after I became a meditator. And it's called the sign of the samana, the sign of the renunciant. Probably the defining feature of monastic practice, in contrast to lay practice, is the emphasis on renunciation. So renunciation is an important idea for all Buddhist practitioners, but it's more of an attitude and an idea in the lay world. Oh, I don't know if I'd even say that. We're all renunciants, right? We all exercise restraint in making our choices in life. We all forego what we want. Often, moment to moment, we'll be resisting impulses to do things that aren't good for us. That's a kind of renunciation, not having that third drink or not getting behind the wheel. That's an important renunciation. That's kind of what makes the world work if you think about it in terms of most people being decent, good people. That's renunciation in action in the lay world. But for a monk, we undertake unnecessary renunciations that go beyond basic delayed gratification and impulse control. We take on renunciations that further our project of turning against what's called the stream of the world, the force of samsara, the turning of the wheel of desire. We take on renunciations like all dressing the same so that we're not so attractive to people. You know from one look at me, I'm not looking for a date. It's very clear. So in foregoing our most basic desires, we greatly heighten our ability to see them. And by seeing them, to do the work of freeing ourselves from them, which doesn't mean eliminating them or never enjoying things. It means giving ourselves the level of awareness that lets us choose. That's what freedom is, ultimately. And as a monk, we commit ourselves to doing that full time, to making that the central project of our lives. And I think for many people, that idea, that renunciatory ideal, is alive in the figure of the monk. There are eras and times in the world where it's corrupted, where monks behave really, really badly. You read about the fleets of Rolls Royces and you think the whole thing is corrupt, or it becomes extremely ossified and bound by orthodoxy and it stops making any sense. And then that image is tarnished. But throughout Buddhist history, there have been renewals after renewals. That's kind of lays at the origins of most or all of the Buddhist orders and sects, is that kind of renewal. So I believe that the sign of the samana is something that's valuable to bring into the world. I often have people stop me and we have really beautiful, if limited in some ways, conversations. And I think that's worth pursuing.
Well, we've come more or less to the end of our conversation and we need to open this up for questions. But just a sort of concluding remark, it reminds me of the four sights, and I think that's what you're referring to, that in the legend of the Buddha's renunciation, he goes out of his privileged palace existence and he sees a sick person, he sees an old person, he sees a corpse, and he sees a fourth sight, which is a wandering monk, a samana, I guess. And this has always struck me because it somehow raises the sense that the monk symbolizes something which has equivalent existential gravitas to birth, sickness, aging, and death. It points to how we could take our lives much more seriously, how a monk in a way symbolizes a radical change in our heart, in our minds, as to how we should live on this earth together. But perhaps we should maybe pause here and open up the space for your questions. we don't have a moderator, so Santi and I are going to point. We'll take turns in signaling who.
Dr. Camp has offered to bring the microphone around.
Okay, there is
We
a
have
roving
two.
mic, which was important. This gentleman here was first, so maybe, and then the fellow in front.
Could you pass that down and it's on?
And you can direct the question at Santi or at me, as you wish, or to both of us.
Thank you both so much for being here. I have a question about if you could say, Stephen, a few words about the intersection, like in places like Gandhara, where Greek culture and Buddhist culture were intersecting and meeting in ancient times, not quite at the time of the birth of these people, but some of the earliest. Is there anything interesting to point out about that? I'm curious to know.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We know that when Alexander the Great went to conquer the Persian Empire and ended up, in fact, in this place you call Gandhara. Gandhara was the easternmost extent of the Persian Empire. It's equivalent to modern Pakistan. In other words, it's the westernmost part, northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent. And in Greek records, namely, well, in fact, in Diogenes Laertius, the text I cited, he says quite explicitly that Pyrrho, who was one of the philosophers who traveled with Alexander, studied with gymnosophists, in other words, naked sages, which is a generic Greek term for monks and sadhus and so on who didn't have many clothes. And so there you actually have a clear example. And Diogenes Laertius also says that through his studies with Indian teachers who were probably Buddhists, we don't actually know, that introduced to his philosophy the idea of non-judgment, not taking a position on things, which is a very basic early Buddhist idea, to have a kind of equanimous, non-judgmental state of mind, a bit like a mindfulness state of mind. And that non-judgmentality then became a central feature of what we now know as skepticism. Pyrrho was the founder of the school of skepticism in Greece when he returned home. There's also, even prior to that, Diogenes Laertius speaks of the philosopher Democritus, who was the first thinker to introduce the idea of a totally materialistic view of the world, an atomic theory. Everything was just atoms and void. And Democritus too, according to Greek sources, is said to have gone to India to study. So it's not just some new age sort of pop philosophy, but this is grounded in early texts. So you do have, and Democritus lived at the time of the Buddha. In fact, they were, again, contemporaries. So it goes back even before then. We have this idea. And then as Greek thought developed, you find the Stoics, the Epicureans, the skeptics, of course. And those schools have weird Buddhist flavors to them. In fact, I mentioned Richard Gombrich. His father was a man called Sir Ernst Gombrich. He's a great figure in history of art and so on. And Richard told me once, he said, when his father said, well, what's all this Buddhism about? And Richard explained it to him, and he said, well, that's Stoicism. And I think that is a sound judgment. So what I'm beginning to realize is that there existed for many hundreds of years what we might call a Helleno-Buddhist cultural sphere, which extended all the way from Athens, across the Silk Road, all the way to China, right down into central India. We know from donative inscriptions on some of the earliest rock-carved temples in India that go back to like the time of Christ, that there were Greek sponsors for these temples. We know that the first European to become a Buddhist monk like him was a man called Dhammarakkhita, a Greek, and that was in the 3rd century BC, the time of Ashoka. So the extent, as you described, when Alexander came in to the Indian area, he carved, the Persian Empire basically became a Hellenistic cultural sphere, and that overlapped in Gandhara particularly, with Afghanistan, Pakistan, were centers of Buddhism, these two groups interacted. And the extent to which they influenced each other is still a matter of scholarly debate. I don't want to get into that. But clearly there was a commonality, a broad commonality of ideas, of practices, of disciplines, of philosophy that they both shared, and they coexisted quite happily. One of the other things that unites Buddhism and Greek philosophy is that they both came to an end because of the rise of Abrahamic monotheism. All of the countries that previously where Greek philosophy flourished as a practice became Christian. The Christians violently stamped out these schools, and a similar thing happened a few hundred years later with the Islamic invasions of India across the Silk Road. In fact, most of the countries all of the places in India and Central Asia that were Buddhist then became Islamic. So they were both, as it were, elements of what are loosely called the pagan world. And so what's interesting in our time nowadays is that both of these traditions are beginning to resurface, not just at the Renaissance, but right up now. You have you have Stoic groups, you have Buddhist groups, you have mindfulness, and I think it's all, as it were, the return of a world that was suppressed by the Christian and Islamic movements that replaced it. All of this is in the book, by the way. The gentleman in front of you. Mike, please.
Master Fred will bring it over. Okay.
So not to waste time, I'll quickly apologize for being seriously resistant to scholarly discussion. I do have a Buddhist background, and I find that scholarliness thinking is interferes with maybe being a person in the present moment. Mindfulness, let's say, seems like that's brand new, and there's not many thoughts that go with it when it's happening. I was wondering, though, like, again, because this is in reflection of a resistance to scholarliness, like, what's the final point of Buddhism? Like, you know, I want the whole thing. Like, why? Like, it's one thing to say, you know, like, you could eat a meal and satiate your hunger. Kind of something to do while you're waiting. But could you say something about, like, a guy like me always kind of wondered, well, like, why are you teaching this? You know, or why are you demonstrating renunciation? What's good about that?
Well, I think we should both have a shot at answering this question. It's a good question. I would say, to summarize, that this practice of Dharma, and I agree with you, scholarship can definitely get in the way. It can be a digression, it can be a way of somehow not dealing with the real issues of life, but actually of spending more time just thinking about things. To me, it boils down to a way of life, a practice that is essentially ethical, that has to do, in the first instance, with embracing the situation we find ourselves in with an open, non-reactive mind, being aware of what rises up, our reactive patterns, letting that be, not get entangled within that, not suppressing it, learning how to see those reactive patterns fade away or stop, or simply noticing in mindfulness how mindfulness is already non-reactive. You can be aware of this stuff. And that then affords us a capacity to find within ourselves a space of non-reactive freedom that can become the basis for then responding to life situations rather than just habitually reacting to them.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks for that great question. That's a real question. I hear it coming from a deep response to what you're engaging here, and I don't think you're the only one to have that reaction, at least sometimes, to how did you put it? Scholarly. That's a polite way to put it. Scholarly, back and forth, intellectualizing. For me, a fundamental principle of not just of practice but of life is that anything, almost anything, maybe anything, can be handled in a way that's skillful and beneficial, or unskillful and detrimental. Stephen's articulated beautifully for us in some of his books how even Buddhism can be used to corral people and manipulate people and control people. A knife can cut, or it can be used, to perform surgery. It can be used to kill somebody. It can be used to save somebody's life. The same is true of intellectualizing. I mentioned before my impression that, we have a variety of temperaments. Some people are more inclined to figuring things out intellectually. Some people are more inclined to figuring things out at the feeling level, through the heart, through intuition. Some, slang at the monasteries, there are faithy types and there are thinky types. These ideas, for many of us, are alive. They're really important. We can get lost in them. We can spend our whole lives wandering around in them without ever getting to what used skillfully they can point us towards. Right? We can just read the recipe, study the recipe, understand the recipe, but never cook the dish and taste the food. And yet there's a lot to be gained by studying and understanding the recipe. We can learn to make the dish. Oh, I did want to point to one thing that you mentioned, which I think bears mention for many modern Buddhist practitioners, which is the widespread idea that all you have to do is be present. All you need is mindfulness, and all your problems are solved. I'm not trying to say that that's what you were saying, but something like that is a misconception, I think, of what the Buddha was actually teaching, as I understand it. Maybe, I don't know if you have more to say about that, Stephen, but mindfulness is a resource. It's a faculty that we have, along with many other of our human capacities, like thinking and feeling and being patient, being kind. Mindfulness might enhance our positive faculties. It might steer us towards them, but we need to use those other faculties too. Mindfulness alone is not enough.
Thank you. Okay.
That was a quote, by the way.
Okay, this gentleman here, please.
Thank you. So we're all aware of the big demographic shift away from institutionalized traditional forms of religion, especially for people under 30. And it seems like Buddhisms, in their variety, religious, secular, mindfulness, are uniquely positioned to connect to or influence that growing group. Is there a particular challenge that you see facing this, or a particular pitfall that needs to be avoided for these core doctrines to become more influential on modern society?
Yeah, I think we can both have a go at that one. Do you want to start, or? Okay. I've struggled with this question. I've been engaging with that question for a long time. And my basic answer is I don't know. And also, I think to some extent, the way in which something as complex as Buddhism, when that engages with something as complex as the modern world, it's going to play out in all kinds of iterations. And if we look at the history of Buddhism, it usually takes at least a couple of centuries before the Dharma Buddhism finds another configuration that is well adapted to the particular circumstances in which it finds itself. So Buddhism goes to China, for example, in about the 1st century AD. It's not really until about the 5th century that you get something that you could begin to recognize as Chinese Buddhism. Same in Tibet, same in Burma, and so on. So in other words, we're talking about processes that are intergenerational. And I think we have to be careful not to privilege our particular present as somehow, rather, we've got much better access to information and so forth and so on. I think that Buddhism, like probably all other religions, has to be thought of as more comparable to an organic, like a tree or something that grows over time and takes new shapes and forms over periods of centuries, rather than within a time that we as individuals might be living. So I don't really know. And I think all that we can do is our best to speak from our heart, to seek to actually understand the conflicts and the suffering of the world we're in, and to try to draw from Buddhism, in my case, or Santi's case, practices, philosophies that might help to address these crises in ways that people can better respond to them. And I think that's all we can do. What that then leads to in, let's say, the next 100 years, I haven't got a clue. But I guess I do feel that as the Dharma finds itself in modernity, it perhaps may become more individuated, in the sense that it won't be so much of a mass movement where everybody kind of thinks the same and you have an elite body of priests or theologians who tell people what's what. But I think it is perhaps becoming more a movement that can empower individual men and women, specific groups and communities, to develop in ways that are distinctive and true to their own history and their own conditions, and yet are somehow also informed by Buddhist principles and values. And I think the one lesson we might learn from the history of Buddhism is that once you get a religious institution that reaches a certain mass and achieves a certain degree of power, political power, social power, it tends to ossify, it tends to freeze in some way. And I think perhaps therefore the question is there some way we can communicate these values in a way that has a kind of a self-destruct mechanism built in, that once it gets to a certain size, we can see the warning signs of not getting trapped in another body. But that just might be the way that human culture evolves. It goes through periods of creativity, it goes through periods of stasis, it goes through periods of decline, and that may be something we simply have to live with.
I think that answer is quite sufficient.
All right. Beautiful. Next question. Yes, this gentleman here. And then there's another hand up there. Can you help me understand? Microphone, please.
Can you help me understand the subtitle of your book, please? The Ethics of Uncertainty. I got the ethics part. I wanted to understand the uncertainty part a little bit better.
Okay. That might take a little bit too long to cover adequately here. The title, as Sumi read it out, and it's a work, it may not actually end up as that, but it's called, what did I call it? Notes for an Ethics of Uncertainty. And notes, again, is something provisional. The danger would be to set up an ethics of uncertainty about which I have complete certainty. That would somehow undermine the whole idea. But what I'm trying to flag with this expression, an ethics of uncertainty, is to honor and to accept the uncertainty that lies at the heart of probably all major ethical choices we make. In some senses, I'm stating the obvious, but I'm bringing it to the surface. When I'm faced with a real difficult moral dilemma, it's a dilemma because I don't know what to do. And we have, I think, a deep-seated mental habit to always want to be right. When you're having an argument with a friend, it boils down to I'm right, you're wrong, and we try to sort of talk the person out of their error so we can replace their error with our rightness. So we have to be careful that we crave certainty, because we think certainty will give us security, certainty will give us something sound to base upon. I think both the Buddha and Socrates are very suspicious of that kind of metaphysical certainty, that we can find some ground of reality, we call it God, we call it emptiness, we call it Buddha nature, it doesn't really matter. But I think that can get in the way of actually responding to specific dilemmas of a moral or ethical nature in our world, in which we need to honor the fact that we cannot know in advance what is the right thing to do. At the same time, we very often find ourselves in circumstances where we cannot not respond. We're called upon to say something, to do something, because of a deep need or necessity to not just let the suffering go on, but to actually intervene. But to recognize that we cannot foresee the outcome of what that intervention might be. It could be that we have the best motivation in the world, we've got a good understanding of the situation, and we make things worse. This happens all the time. So it's to try to, the idea is to bring uncertainty into our reflections upon the nature of what it means to be ethical, and not to sort of try to pretend that we have a certainty about things which we don't. So in that sense, it's an ethics of risk, and it's an ethics of humility, and it's an ethics of care, I would say. That becomes primary, rather than we act ethically because we've got all the right answers.
I think we might have time for one more question.
Okay, this lady here. Let's have the lady here. You put your, and then if we have time with you. Yes? Microphone, please.
It's 5:27. It's pointing out the time.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So first of all, thank you for your presentations. And Stephen, I love your description of Buddhism as being geared towards clear seeing and action. My wondering is, every person who's asked a question today has been a man. You guys are men. What's happened to women's religions? Why do you think they have not lasted? And are they coming to more of an awareness with compassion, etc.? Just a wondering.
Last Tuesday I was in New York, and I attended a presentation at the Asia Society with Helen Tworkov, who was the founder of Tricycle magazine, a woman, and Pico Aya, the travel writer. And Pico asked Helen, you know, what do you see as the main difference of Buddhism in modernity or the West as opposed to Asia? And the first thing she said was women. That we're not maybe representative here in this particular room, but I feel, and I see this, and I've seen this emerging very powerfully in my last, all of the time I've been involved in Buddhism, that women's voices are certainly becoming more prominent. There is a strong emphasis in most of the traditions that have established themselves in the West to create opportunities and for women teachers, at the same time also to acknowledge greater diversity within our communities, to affirmatively encourage women, people of color, gay people, and so on, to become more vocal and more prominent in the kind of Buddhism that is emerging in our culture. I don't know whether your question was about historical forms of religion or not, but again, one thing that perhaps is remarkable about the Buddhist tradition is that it's the first tradition that actually has amongst its canonical texts a text written by women for women called the Theravada, the verses of the senior nuns, if you like. So there are precursors there, but as you rightly said, the nuns' order died out in India, I think. It never really made it into Tibet. It's only really flourished in East Asia, in China particularly, in Korea, Taiwan, where you do find very powerful Buddhist communities of women. And there's about as many nuns as there are monks, although Probably in the hierarchy, the monks are still on top. But I think we have an opportunity in our present culture to overcome the paternalistic bias that I think has infected all religions. And I think that is acknowledged more and more and more in the Buddhist world. And I very much hope that we level out and no longer sort of play out the paternalistic, patriarchal models of that were dominant in Asia.
If I could add to that as well,
please.
I think it is important to acknowledge the particularly rough, difficult road that women have had in the monastic world throughout Buddhist history. The dying out of the women's monastic order in Theravada Buddhism was not a peaceful dying. It's not a peaceful death. It was a matter of repression. And in many Buddhist cultures, women monastics are treated very unequally. Despite the equality of numbers, in many cases, women monastics will spend their entire lives in a kind of subservient role, literally like cooking for the male monastics. That has started to change with the incursions of modernity into the majority Buddhist countries, where state Buddhism is, or de facto state Buddhism, is the order of the day. There has been, very little progress, but in some cultures, in Sri Lanka, there are, I believe it's over 10,000 fully ordained bhikkhunis, women fully ordained monastics. That's a really important sign of progress in the Theravada world. And women have continued to be ordained in the Mahayana world. I think that's really important for monastics, of course, for women to have the opportunity to devote their lives to renunciation full time. I think it's important for the lay world as well to provide that possibility as something to think about, as something as an example that shows it's possible to live a different way for men as well as for women. And I think as a male monastic, it's important to say that, because you can assume, well, you're all trying to look alike and you're very, conforming to telling the same story. That's actually not the case. There's a lot of support for full ordination for women in monastic communities, and it seems like it's inevitable.
Okay. I think we have to close there. It's
right on time.
5:30. Perfect time. Thank you for that last question. Thank you for all the questions.
A few final notes before our reception. As this is the final Frankie program gathering until September, I just want to take a few moments to recognize some colleagues who've made our events possible this year. The staff of the Whitney Humanities Center, especially Diane Brown, Ashley Cohen, Sandra Mellon Bowles, they lend us tremendous support and do all of their jobs wonderfully. Tony Sudol, whose technical expertise makes our events possible, and his colleague Ty Claxton in the back. Ty, thank you for all of your help today and always. Rick Leone and his colleagues at Yale Broadcast, especially Guy Ordaleva, who record our events and turn them into wonderful videos that receive scores of views on Yale's YouTube channel. Covering for them today is Bruce Becker in the back with Geomatrix Productions. Thank you, Bruce. We're known for our receptions, and you'll soon see why. Matthew Jacob and the staff at Coromandel, who cover all of them. So we're very grateful to have them here with us again today. David Sarasi with Fitzgerald's Florists. They ensure that the Frankie program really does have the best floral arrangements anywhere at Yale, and that is really saying something when you go to the Beinecke's events and see what they have. Tanisha Leal and the custodial staff for their support and professionalism. And finally, you probably don't know that we have a famous YouTube star with us today. He's rather undercover as the unremunerated microphone lad, my son Frederick. I have to say, he has devoted countless hours over many Frankie events in the last year and a half. He cheerfully accepts every menial task I throw at him without complaint. and he's just for Fred on YouTube. I told him I would name drop him and thank him. So he deserves our gratitude. And our likes to speak his language. So now we'll repair to the lobby for the reception, the book signing with Dr. Batchelor's books, and continued conversation. So please join us. Thank you.